Luc Besson's 2014 film Lucy garnered criticism even before it premiered. This criticism stems from the movie's foundational claim that we only use 10% of our brain. It is an obvious myth that anyone with a rudimentary knowledge of neuroscience could debunk. In fact, the famous case of the railroad construction foreman Phineas Gage is enough to debunk this nonsensical claim. However, this film, despite its scientific flaws, provides a more novel and nuanced way to think about how consciousness works. In the philosophy of mind, one of the most pressing issues is the hard problem of consciousness formulated by the philosopher David Chalmers. To be clear, I am not a neuroscientist, and I actually don't believe that neuroscience will, quote, solve the hard problem. The purpose of this video is to provide intuition as to how to understand consciousness and the problems with Chalmers' framing. In a 2014 TED Talk, Chalmers described consciousness as a movie in the head, saying,
"At the heart of this movie is you, experiencing all this directly. This movie is your stream of consciousness. Consciousness is one of the fundamental facts of human existence."
But fortunately for us, Besson's Lucy provides us with a way to tackle it. Like Besson's film, Chalmers' framing of consciousness falls prey to a myth. In this case, it is the myth of the given, the idea that experiences come to us with a sort of foundational, unmediated certainty. Philosopher Wilfrid Sellars attacked this notion in his seminal work, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. However, one can expound upon this concept to realize that consciousness can exist at different levels and that our consciousness is just one of many levels. Here are just a few examples. The change blindness experiments of psychologists Daniel Simon and Chris Chabris at Harvard show that even adult consciousness is susceptible to perceptual blindness. V.S. Ramachandran's and Colin Blakemore's studies of blindsight in patient Graham Young show that human consciousness can be rendered to that of a cognitively lower animal like an octopus, as unconscious perceptions can demonstrably influence behavior, such as when one is driving.
But Ramachandran has come across an even stranger condition, a remarkable ability of the brain that allows you to see even though you are totally blind. This rare condition is called blindsight. Ramachandran found Graham Young in Oxford, England. He is one of the world's few known blindsight patients. This paradoxical condition shows just how much our brains run our lives without our being aware of it. The main visual centers in humans occupy nearly half the brain, in a large region towards the back of the head. Graham's vision was devastated by the accident. Today, he can see to the left, but is blind to everything on the right, in both eyes.
You can see things over here.
Oh yes, I can see.
I'm going to move my hand across. You tell me when it appears, when it comes into view.
Now.
Very precisely as it enters the seeing part of your field.
Yeah.
And if I just hold over here and you look there, you can't see anything?
No.
How about now?
You're moving it up and down.
But you're seeing it.
It's very easy for me to say to you, "Oh, I saw that move up, Colin." And as soon as I say that, you're going to say, "Ah, he can see." No, I can't.
For patients with associative visual agnosia, we can clearly see that such patients have an ability to clearly perceive familiar objects, but be unable to articulate what they are.
So there are three different versions of agnosia we'll talk. These patients lose the ability to take the basic visual information and form any kind of pattern. So remember, when we talked about feature theories, we talked about recognizing individual features and putting them together to form a pattern and then recognizing that pattern. These individuals with aperceptive agnosia are able to perceive only small local aspects of stimuli. So one of the things we often do with neuropsychology patients is ask them to copy line drawings or copy other sorts of drawings. And so here we can see on the right an aperceptive agnosia patient's attempt to copy these objects. And so what you can see is they focus on individual features. They can't form a whole perception, and so they're drawing only one thing. So here it's this angle. They know this has to be curved. They seem to get the keys or the teeth part of this key, but not the rest of it. So they can't copy even the most basic forms.
So, what seems to be the matter? People seem to think that there's something wrong with my eyes. But you don't recognize any visual problems? Not directly. I wonder if you can describe that image for me, Mr. Phillips. In the distance I see a pile of stacked wood and people walking on what I assume to be a path. There are lots of bright colours. Okay, thank you.
The late philosopher James Corman has more on this subject for those interested, but it is worth noting that we are not always directly conscious in the way that Chalmers thinks. But even when we are not afflicted with the aforementioned neuropathologies, our consciousness is still not absolute. Our experiences become more vivid with our increasing capacity for conceptualization. This figure is meant to illustrate that notion. Apprehension of a percept is specific to the conceptual and psychological context of the perceiver. One could describe apprehension as how much meaning or conceptual weight a specific percept carries. Spoiler alert at this point. Mild spoilers coming. In taking with the 10% brain usage myth, Luc Besson's Lucy begins with our protagonist named Lucy, who has been captured by the goons of a Korean mob boss to be a drug mule and transport a blue powdery drug called CPH4 to Europe without getting caught. A bag containing the drug is surgically implanted in her abdomen. While in captivity, awaiting transport via flight, her captor kicks her in the stomach, releasing the drug inside her. It is at this point, roughly 26 minutes into the film, that the following title card appears on the screen. Her brain usage has doubled. She is now twice as conscious as the average human. She experiences the world very differently. Chinese characters automatically decipher themselves before her very eyes. She no longer feels pain.
Somebody put a bag of drugs in me. I need you to remove it. It's leaking. Do it now.
Right. I'll just administer a local anesthetic.
Don't bother.
Right.
In fact, she can even feel the taste of her mother's breast milk in her mouth.
I remember the taste of your milk in my mouth.
In this world, Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness would be reframed as the hard problem of 10% brain usage. Let's examine this framing for a bit. Such a framing benefits us because the hard problem is now one of a third-person phenomenon, using 1/10 of the brain, rather than a nebulous first-person experience of a movie in the head. The film progresses with several similar title cards, showing Lucy's increasing cerebral capacity and her new abilities. But as faulty as this film's premise is, it marvelously takes a sledgehammer to the binary of unconscious versus conscious by centering a character who is a step above us normal humans in consciousness. However, what's worse for Chalmers' framing is that such a binary does not even make sense at a human level. We know that the brain develops both in utero and ex utero. Does a fetus taste amniotic fluid? Does a 2-month-old have a subjective experience? Is a 2-month-old conscious? Does a 3-month-old perceive green? Such questions are meant to show that human consciousness is not clear and absolute, but rather messy and murky. In an interview with Robert Lawrence Kuhn for Closer to Truth, science writer and prominent skeptic Michael Shermer described consciousness thusly.
I would just put it as more of a quantitative difference from all other living organisms and their thought processes generated by their brains. I wouldn't say it's anything qualitatively different from anything else in the biological world.
While this is a good description, I nevertheless lament that even when human consciousness is correctly framed as gradations, anthropocentrism still finds a way into the picture. The gradations are often made with comparison to other animals rather than to other humans like infants. We are not the same as who we were at the age of 3 weeks. This is to say that the existence and emergence of our current consciousness is entirely contained within our development from the womb. From the womb, we begin our sense of proprioception, our sense of our body's relative position, and the first sense of which we make extensive use. It seriously remains a mystery to me how this sense was not included in our elementary understanding of 5 senses. Repeated use of this sense builds connections into our brain to form our sense of self. Thus, our consciousness is ultimately the sum total of the constant neuronal stimulation created by our repeated exposure to the world in which we live. These connections are additionally strengthened through an acquired conceptual scheme, a language, and an acquired ability to abstract. This figure from a publication on the development of the human somatosensory cortical functions shows what goes on behind the scenes of our inner movie. Like Chalmers in his talk, one might nevertheless be still tempted to ask why we have these inner movies in the first place. Why don't these experiences occur in the dark? This question is misleading, as is so much of the language used to describe consciousness. Calling them inner movies is not rigorous. It does not get at what one even means by consciousness. As I outlined in the graphical plot previously shown, what is really going on is a vivid conceptual apprehension of perceptual phenomena, our ability not only to sense P, but also to sense P as P. This ability is built up through conceptualization through language, our ability to understand ourselves as perceiving subjects, and repeated familiarity. A 5-year-old might not have a conception of a C major chord as a C major chord, but Beethoven certainly did. Chalmers' absolutist notion would assume that the degree to which our brain is constantly stimulated while we are awake is at its peak. Additionally, his framing treats consciousness as foundational, making any sort of explanation impossible from the outset. If consciousness is just there, what is there to explain? How can one provide an explanation or a foundation for something that is thought to be without explanation or foundation? Lucy, in placing normal human consciousness on a spectrum, serves as a more entertaining and action-packed rebuttal to Protagoras. Man is not the measure of all things. not necessarily. What I love about philosophy is its ability to teach one to question everything, including questions. Understanding where a question is coming from and the assumptions that are woven into it provides a way of tackling a problem from the very outset. It's even better when one can use examples from art, film, music, etc. to do this. Such examples and references not only make philosophy fun, they also serve as good ways to avoid spinning one's wheels in confusion and head-scratching. After all, there's already enough of that today, but especially in philosophy.
Humans consider themselves unique, so they've rooted their whole theory of existence on their uniqueness.